Welcome back. We're thrilled to be joined today for a conversation with Admiral retired Michael Mullen, the 17th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Commissioned as an ensign out of the United States Naval Academy in 1968, Admiral Mullen served 43 years in uniform. His flag officer assignments include Commander of the George Washington Carrier Battle Group, Commander of the U.S. Second Fleet, Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Commander of U.S. Naval Forces Europe, and prior to becoming chairman, was the 28th Chief of Naval Operations. He served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from October 2007 to September 2011. Please join me in a warm welcome for Admiral Mullen. Sir, I'll start off with a question that is keen on a lot of folks' mind. Last September, you were one of 5 former chairmen and 8 former secretaries of defense to co-sign an open letter that reiterated core principles of civilian control of the armed forces. Many observers noted there were probably multiple audiences for the letter and more than one perceived problem it was attempting to address. Why did you co-sign? What did you think were the biggest problems that merited a letter in the first place?
Well, thanks, Heidi, and to all who are there. I very much appreciate that you are. This is a very, very critical both time and topic, and I hope that the work over the course of the day actually generates a lot more thought and discussion down the road, because I think that's what we need. Heidi, specifically with that letter, actually Marty Dempsey, who relieved me as chairman, was one of the individuals that started it. And what hit me when I talked to and his colleague Peter Fever, who I know many of you know, and is there today, really came up with the idea. And what struck me when Peter and I talked about this in particular, and Marty as well, was the need for clarity on the issues of civilian control of the military. And like so many things in these days, that whole issue has gotten eaten up inside the divisiveness and the politics that we're all living in, and particularly those in Washington. And whether it was me in my time or Mark Milleys in his time, current time, it seemingly has just gotten worse and worse. When I retired, I taught up at Princeton for 6 years, and I really developed a course. What I wanted the students, and these were seniors, I wanted them to develop a framework for their own lives, if you will, on values and principles. And you would say, well, why would you have to do that? Again, I think, and that was 10 years ago, we're living in pretty confusing times. We're living in times where the facts are very difficult to dig out. The truth is the truth, and it's not the truth, it seems. And we're just bombarded with that kind of information and disinformation. And so I thought it was really important to try to clarify and lay out principles, not unlike with those kids in Princeton 10 years ago, that sort of guide us. And you mentioned multiple audiences. There clearly are multiple audiences there, whether it's the men and women in uniform, to who this, I think, most directly applies, whether it's to civilians who are either in or aspire to be leaders in our government in very challenging times. And probably as significant as any, it's the American people. And how do we get the right message to the American people about, all of what this means, which is so bedrock to us as a country and as a democracy. I've been in too many countries where civilian control did not exist. Most Americans, if not all, would not want to live in any of those countries. So it really it's who we are very much as a democracy. And it's that, which is one of the reasons, and I don't sign a lot of letters, but I mean, it's one of the reasons I agreed to sign this one.
Just as a follow-up, sir, as a follow-up, who do you think was most in need of reading it? And do you think the message was received?
Well, I actually think it's a beginning. I mean, one of the things I mentioned, the teaching at Princeton, one of the things that, because obviously I was in the middle of civilian control of the military, certainly pretty heavily for the last 10 years in the jobs that I had, but most intensely, obviously, when I was chairman. And it isn't anything that I had spent a lot of time on. I didn't spend a lot of time studying it. I basically assumed, I mean, I knew it, and that's who we were as both a military and as a country. But what I found out when I got to Princeton, I had some time to reflect and read and start to study, which I had not done much of, which is why I think this conference is important. I think we need to do a lot more of it. And become, it's a much more complex subject than I realized, first of all. And then 10 years down the road from when I started including it in this course, it's just gotten that much more difficult because of the polarization. There is, I've said this for years, there's virtually nothing these days that can't get politicized. I used, a few years ago, I used the weather map. You would think that how could a weather map get politicized, and yet it did, and it gets used by politicians on, not the weather map, but it gets used by politicians for their own political gain on both sides of the aisle, that the real sort of the basics, the foundational stuff that is really critical, it just gets lost. And that becomes sort of the way it is as opposed to the way it actually should be. So, I mean, I'm not sure when you say which audience, that's a really tough one, because I think the audiences are, equally important in this regard. And actually, one I didn't mention was political leaders. Literally, political leaders need to read and understand that as well.
So that's a great lead into my next question. You've spoken to this, the unprecedented efforts by politicians and pundits to politicize the military during this time of deep political division. How should senior military leaders, flag officers, navigate this? And I'm wondering what practical advice you might give to those senior officers beyond always follow legal orders.
Yeah, this is a particularly sensitive area for me because you mentioned I graduated in 1968. That was a pretty tough year. I mean, I was young, my early 20s, so I didn't think it was as tough as it actually was, but certainly on reflection, those were very, very challenging times. And my sensitivity in particular was that the military got blamed for the war in Vietnam. And I was hugely sensitive to that when the war in Iraq started in 2003. And over a course of a couple of years, it was clear to me that the American people were able to separate the war and the going to war from the men and women who were serving in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And that separation to me was really clear. But we've been down this path before, and from Vietnam, I mean, the military had to rebuild itself, and it had to do it almost from within. And it took leaders to do it. To me, that's a good model. And I was pretty alarmed last fall, which I think was the first time I'd seen the poll where, and it's now numerous polls, where trust in the military has dropped significantly. I think that we had led the country in terms of the American people trusting the military for decades now, again, back because of that buildup, that effort on the part of leaders in the military over decades. And to see us fall from the top of the list down literally as much as 25% into the high 40s from the mid 70s really alarmed me. If we don't have the trust of the American people, we don't have much of a future. I mean, that's kind of how I look at it. And so given that, one, you have to recognize and accept we've got a problem. You need to identify the cause of that problem. And then the military leaders have to go fix it. This can't be fixed from the outside. This is something that has to be done internally. And it is affecting very badly right now our recruiting, for example. It's like the post 9/11 era is over. All the services, particularly the Army, is having a very difficult time recruiting. And the main reason, it isn't because of the lack of qualified candidates, although that certainly makes it much more challenging. It's been that way for some time, for almost 20 years. The main reason is the influencers are not telling their kids to join. That this is parents, aunts, uncles, coaches, pastors, community leaders who are saying not a good idea right now. That's part of the impact of this politicization, I believe. So we have to turn that around. I don't have an exact solution set, if you will, but where I would start is literally from the day somebody was recruited for the military, and in the officer side, as soon as you became a midshipman or a cadet, I would start there, and I would embed this training and education at every level. We're the best outfit in the world in training people, and we go back to training constantly between tours. I would embed this in every single level of training and education in all the services as rapidly as possible, to reinforce what those principles are, to certainly answer questions about why it's so difficult now. How do you handle it? And that goes far beyond just complying with legal orders. This has to be given a lot of thought. It needs to be worked very, very hard. And back to what I said earlier, I didn't really understand how complex this was until literally after I had left the military and really had some time to reflect on it. So I think that's the one way to attack it. But I think it's up to the military to take this, recognize the trend, and try to turn it around. It's not a matter of trying to turn it around. We have to turn it around.
So I appreciate that. That's been a theme thus far of our two previous panels on this need for constant sensitization and training, recommitment to norms, and so forth. Relatedly, when you were chairman, you often spoke about the need for the military to remain nonpartisan, and even called for the military's nonpartisan ethic to extend into retirement. But we haven't seen any abatement of partisan campaign endorsements by retired flag officers, and public partisan commentary by retired flag officers is no longer just confined to a campaign and election season. Can I ask you why in your mind, has flag officer peer pressure not been more successful in discouraging fellow retired generals and admirals from refraining from such behavior? Your thoughts?
That's very hard for me to answer in terms of trying to figure out why. I think, there are, and it is a handful. It's not, widely done, but the handful are very visible. My own sense is this really started in the Iraq War timeframe, particularly when retired officers, not just flag officers, but retired lieutenant colonels, retired commanders as well, who would be paid handsomely, quite frankly, by these media outlets to appear and in too many cases criticize the policy, whether it was, in my time, whether it was Bush's policy or Obama's policy. And do that, quite frankly, in many cases without a level of knowledge about what was really going on. I adopted, actually, in that time frame, somebody that I admire greatly, which was the George Marshall approach, which is you never take the uniform off. I get that you do. I get that you're a civilian. I get that you have all the constitutional rights that everybody else has. Some of which have been restricted while you've been in uniform, and understandably so, which we understand, quite frankly. But what I think we miss is how impactful these comments can be on what I used to call the farmer in Peoria, the American citizen out there who listens to you as an expert, active duty or retired, lieutenant colonel or 4-star, and that you are absolutely right. And I know, certainly when I was in the job, there were a lot that were absolutely wrong, just based on the facts. But that has picked up over time. It is part of the transition, if you will, which has been going on for years now, of how the media performs and or actually does their work, and they do it without facts. And the high ground for them is, well, we need experts to do this. I don't know. I think the damage that we've done far exceeds the value of the expertise to, quote unquote, explain something to the American people. And I also think, I'm actually taken back and more appalled at the level of compensation that some of these individuals draw to do this, expertise notwithstanding. The other thing, Heidi, to me is, I was taught, pretty early in my life, and particularly in the military life, you don't bring up sex, politics, and religion. And, that's kind of one of those principles that, and there's a reason for that, because they're so emotional. And people's feelings are, they run so deep, whether you agree with them or not. And I think that's part of what you see as to why individuals do it. I thought, it wasn't watershed, because I'd been watching this for years. I had friends of mine that appeared on the podium with John Kerry at the Democratic Convention in 2004. And I'm looking at them and going, what is that all about? It has continued on both sides of the aisle. And actually, because there are a few academics there, I'd love somebody to do some kind of analysis to see if that actually makes a difference in a campaign. Does somebody actually, get enough of a boost by having retired Hugh Pickett behind them in a way that it impacts results? So we're throwing a lot at it. We're giving up a lot of who we are. And we're also teaching everybody on active duty, well, this must be okay. So when I get out, maybe I'll go do that. And that certainly has continued. And then the last thing I'd say in this, if a veteran wants to get into politics, please do. And once a veteran has made the decision to run for some office, I consider them a politician from that point on. So have at it. But that's those individuals, and we need more and more of them, quite frankly. And we have a few more now in Congress than we've had in a while, particularly coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. But if you want to really get into it, please do. But if you don't, maybe I'd sum it up. So I worry a great deal. We're damaging, individuals are doing much more damage to the institution they loved, that they lived in, that they served in for decades, then it's worth the time, spending their time trying to answer the mail to, the media, quite frankly.
Thanks for that. And Peter is here in our audience, and he will tell you he led a study a few years back that showed that campaign endorsements by retired flag officers don't tend to move the needle. They don't tend to have an impact on voter choice, which brings all of your points that you raise into further scrutiny. I want to transition to talk about those still on active duty. And General Mark Milleys has 7 months left in his tenure as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's some debate as to who the author of this quote is, whether it's Peter or whether it's Corey Shockey. But one of them once said, in assessing his tenure, he ought to be graded like an Olympic diver, with a degree of difficulty factored into his score, in recognition of the extraordinary tensions he faced during the Trump administration. How would you assess his tenure on the whole, and what advice would you give to General Milleys' successor as chairman?
The way and I'll come to Milley in a second, every chairman has 4 tough years, no matter what they are. I could tell you the challenges that I had, so could Marty Dempsey, Joe Dunford, and now Mark Milley. And they are extremely challenging jobs. And I've spoken to each one of them as they took these jobs. Well, one of the things that, and I had no clue myself, is we have no idea the world we're walking into. People ask me what it was like to be chairman. It's a great privilege. Middle-class kid from Southern California could get to the #1 military job in the country. Isn't it a great country? And it's a real privilege to serve and represent the 2 million men and women who wear uniform, active, reserve and guard. On the other hand, when you walk into the White House, you are alone. You are the only uniform in the room, and you're walking into an organization and a place that does politics 24/7, 365. It has always been thus. It's not just now. It's tougher now, but it's always been that way. And it is a foreign world to those of us in the military. And there's precious little to no training for that, except your background. But you haven't spent time in the White House in any significant way. You certainly haven't spent time in the political world. And any political any administration is going to want to, in its own way, even subliminally, they're going to try to manipulate you to generate their political outcomes. And when you get in the way of that as the military and as a military leader, that starts to create a lot of tension. And that's just the way it is. And you have to stand up to that. I've said we have to remain apolitical. The chairman has to give his best military advice. And then when the president makes a decision, we march off. Back to Marshall, I don't know if this is true for a fact, but it fits him and his character. Marshall said at one point in time, the more he personally disagreed with a decision on the part of the president, the more he exuberantly supported it, in public, just to send that message. So that's who we are. That's who we are as a country, and we have to do that no matter who the president is. I think with respect to Milley in particular, I actually I hadn't heard that until I read the questions. I kind of like that degree of difficulty. I don't think we really know what happened. I don't think anybody except Mark and a few people around the president really know how hard that was. And the history books will come to that. I'm loath to, given how difficult this job is for anybody that is in it, I'm loath to criticize one way or another. I think Mark knows, he made a big mistake when he went to Lafayette Square, and certainly a few days later stood up in front of the world and apologized for that and admitted that. It is also, he's serving at a time where the politicization has gotten that much worse. I think we all can agree with that. And I think all of that will be part of the assessment, if you will, of his legacy and how that, how that is seen. And there'll be plenty of people that will study and write about that down the road. I'll leave you one last thought. And I know we're in DC, and someone that worked for me not too long after I took over for the chairman's job said, well, Chairman, one of the things you need to, think about, and this is like a month in, one of the things you need to think about and be concerned about is your legacy. And I looked at that individual, I said, don't ever say that again. My legacy is going to be what my legacy is. And I'm focused on the job, best military advice. I'm in 2 wars, plus I've got a reasonably significant terrorism threat I'm fighting. That's where I will focus, and it'll be what it'll be. I've known Milley a long time. He's a terrific officer. He worked for me. He's a terrific officer. I have an understanding of how difficult his job has been, although I don't have nearly all the details that I think eventually will be understood. And in that regard, I admire him, for what he's done. He's had a tough one.
Thanks, sir. When General Milleys' successor becomes the 21st chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we will have had more chairmen serve in the post-Goldwater Nichols era than in the pre-Goldwater Nichols era. How well has Goldwater Nichols held up nearly 40 years later? And from the perspective of a former chairman, what areas might be in need of a new round of reform today?
And you asked about the next, Heidi, you asked about advice for the next chairman as well. I mean, my advice actually would go along the lines of at least understand you're walking into a brave new world, a world you've not seen before. The only modern chairman that had any kind of background and preparation for that job along the lines of what I was talking about was Colin Powell, because he had been the national security advisor. So he had worked in that environment for a couple of years at one point in time when he was Bush 41's national security advisor. But the advice would come along those lines. 1, 2, get good people around you. That's advice for any leader. 3, get a diversity of views around you. The way I've talked about this to senior leaders historically is the more senior I got, the more diverse views I needed in the room to make the best decision, and would certainly advise whoever the next chairman is going to be to think about that as well. It's a job unlike any other. It's not. I was a chief for a couple of years as well. You think you know what's going on, and you move from one job to another, and you find out there's a whole new world out there that you just haven't been in. So I think along those lines. Goldwater Nichols, I think on the officer side, if you will, and on the restructuring of the chain of command to go from POTUS to SecDef to the combatant commanders is exactly right. I don't. Although, because I've got some thinkers in the room, one of the things I'm struggling with right now, and this will generate a few responses, is whether we're aligned for the current world. I could spend a lot of time on this, but the world changed on 24 Feb, and when Putin went into Ukraine, and whether we are, and I don't just mean from a combatant command standpoint, I use that as sort of a stalking horse, but whether we are aligned correctly for the future, given the alignment that Russia and China now have, and whether we should be looking at something like a Eurasia command, as opposed to the way we're focused right now, that gets me to something I believe strongly in, which is unity of command, unity of effort, unity of focus. And right now we're not, we're split. We're sort of east and west, right and left, however you want to look at it. So that, I think that aspect of it has worked really well, including the combatant commands and the ability to fight. That what is broken and has been broken almost from the beginning is the acquisition side. The acquisition side is and my fix to that is get the uniforms back involved, put the service chiefs in charge of the acquisition piece, if you will. It has been very specifically divided between the uniforms and the civilians who go buy stuff, the uniforms who generate the requirements, and the civilians who buy it. I think the JROC has been broken for years. It needs to go away. I think another place that's just out of control from a money standpoint and a effectiveness standpoint is DHA. That's another place that just ought to go away. Give that back to the services, particularly as we're looking at this changed world in terms of how do we do healthcare? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we take care of troops in war, if you will, particularly given the changed environment and the possibilities with respect to China? I'd be curious if I watched a war game on Taiwan, whether anybody would be spending any time in the medical annex, if you will. And given what CSIS has done recently, and just in terms of the war game and the number of casualties that got generated, how are we preparing for that kind of war? It's been a long time since we've been in anything like that. So that, I mean, that's you could fill the room you're in with acquisition studies. We need relief from regulations. We need to be able to move more swiftly. We need to be able to take more risk. We need to reward and incentivize those who are innovators, not kill them, which is what we do inside the building. So that part of Goldwater Nichols, to me, is completely broken and is, quite frankly, responsible for the acquisition system that we have right now.
Thank you, sir. I have one more question, and then I'll invite members of the audience to join in here. But my last question for you is, you were one of 35 retired senior flag officers to sign an amicus brief in the 2 affirmative action cases before the Supreme Court this term. The amicus brief argued that diversity in the armed forces is a national security imperative, and overturning race-conscious admissions policies will negatively impact diversity in the officer corps especially. It seems likely that the Supreme Court will overturn race-conscious policies in admissions, and we can expect uniformed leaders to be called to testify to Congress on the nature and extent of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the military as part of House oversight. What advice would you give to senior military leaders on how to best engage on the topic of diversity within the force, to elected leaders, and to the American public?
I think the American public, back to, we were talking about audiences before in your previous question. I think the American public is the one that's really a key here. Each audience is critical, but the American public is really key. And, when I was CNO, which was 2005 to 2007, I made essentially diversity a top priority for me very visibly. I didn't go into a room, I didn't go to an audience and not bring it up. I didn't care. It could have been about shipbuilding, it could have been about any subject, but I included it. And I think that's really key for leaders. But the driver for me on that was to look at, first of all, my enlisted force, and I'll come to more specifically about that, which from a diversity, equity, inclusion piece is in much better shape than the officer corps. Secondly, and I'm focused on the Navy back then, and I'm focused very specifically on women and minorities, because I think we were moving as an officer corps farther and farther away from America. And the challenge that we have is, I will commission the flag officer group for 2053 here in a couple of months. And that the percentage of women and minorities that are in that group, that's going to be the percentage of women and minorities I have in the Flag Corps 30 years from now. And it's going to be underrepresented, and it's going to be severely underrepresented, particularly with respect to women and minorities. And it's not just African Americans, it's also Hispanics and Asians. And so I wanted to move as fast as I could. And in the officer world, we have no ability to lateral in people in any kind of significant way to try to rebalance if we get that wrong. So if I'm at 10% women now, 30 years from now, I'm at 10% women in my Flag Corps. And so my position on that has been, we're going to be completely disconnected from the American people in terms of who we represent, in terms of their support, all those things. And I think that is existential to us as a force. That has clearly gotten subsumed in what has become this, this debate right now with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion. But that's not just about the United States Navy or the United States military. We've got, this has been an issue that I've actually been alongside since the 60s. When I mentioned growing up in Los Angeles, and I came back from my youngster cruise, and I'm at home in my nice little comfortable middle-class home in LA, and Watts is burning 15 miles from here. And I'm going, what is going on there? That was in the 60s, obviously a very tumultuous time, the next 10 or 15 years. And I have said, I think we've made a lot of progress. I think we have. Sometimes we give ourselves credit for too much progress in these areas, but we got a long way to go. And if George Floyd didn't send one message, or if it sent only one message, that was it. And we got to go back. We don't have to relive everything, but we have to recognize there are deep-rooted issues of inequalities in this country that we as leaders have to address. For the military to be and particularly the officer corps, the leadership group, to be non-representative of that in the future makes no sense to me, quite frankly. And that's one of the reasons I would sign up to the two amicus briefs that you talked about. It's going to take, no matter what happens in DEI, it's going to take us a long time to get where we need to get. But we can't, I don't think, step back away from it and ignore the reality, particularly of generations to come. And you look at that, the mix, the ethnic mix, the background, the immigrant mix, et cetera, of who we're going to be as a country. And we need to be out in front of that. And we're starting out, particularly in the officer corps, we're behind.
Thank you, sir. At this time, we'd like to open up questions from the audience. So please line up behind one of the two microphone stands in each of your aisles. And when I call on you, please go ahead and state your name your affiliation, and your question.
Hi, sir. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mike Kingery with the Air Force. I had a question for you. In the Trump administration, we saw a number of general officers in senior positions, General Kelly, General Mattis, among others. What are your thoughts on putting these recently retired generals in these positions, and does that betray the true spirit of civilian control of the military?
Well, I've got a lot of time for Mattis and a lot of time for Austin. I know them, I work with them a lot, and they're extraordinary people. But when the Mattis thing was coming up, I said then, and I still feel the same way, there was a reason that it was 50 years between George Marshall and Jim Mattis. And I think we need to pay attention to that reason. So I'm not a big fan of it. I know that everybody goes in, wanting to get it right, help the country. I mean, I've known Mattis, Kelly, Austin, and others, and they're devoted to that. But it goes back to what I said before. I don't think anybody really understands what you're getting into when you walk into the White House with our background, and that includes, Jim Mattis and Lloyd Austin. They have found that out, if you will. And I think one of the indicators of that was what Mattis ran into, which at one point, obviously at a point in time, put him in a position to resign. And I thought he did the admirable thing with respect to that. But that's an indication of the challenge that's there. So I'm not in favor of it. I think we can say, yes, Mattis and Austin, good experiment. Let's move on and let's have civilian leaders from now on.
Thank you. Freddie, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mullen. My name is Freddie. I'm one of Dr. Urben's students in the Security Studies program. I wanted to pull a little bit on the thread you made of participation in politics by former active duty service members. You stated that you're not a huge fan of active participation in public discourse by former members, but then you also said you're encouraging them to run for office themselves. And I wanted to pull on that thread a little bit because it seems to me that although you make the distinction between service member and politician, as you said, it doesn't strike me that most members of the public do. So how can you kind of square those two? Because isn't it the kind of peak of participating in, openly political discourse for a former service member to run for office?
It's a good question. I just fundamentally believe that we need more veterans in Congress. I come from a time, and somebody there can do the math, but when I first started to work heavily in Washington in the 90s and certainly the 80s or 70s, those who were in Congress and had served in the military, the vast majority of whom were World War II, the numbers were up in the 70% of them. And they had an understanding of every aspect of it. And they were on both sides of the aisle. That dwindled down to single digits over the course of my time. And I think now it's maybe back up to like 20%, which I think is a good thing because I think they know us. They also have, having been in the military, they've had lived experiences. It's not all isolated to their small town in small town USA, if you will. They've met a very diverse group of people in very challenging circumstances, and they have a very common ground in serving their country, even though they may have different views. I've very clearly drawn the line for me that if you want to run for politics and become a politician, I think that's fine. But all the other participation, and I think part of where I am right now which is all the pundits need to go away. And maybe a few years ago, I wouldn't have said that, but I think it's gotten so severe and had such a negative impact that it's time to just see them step aside. And we'll figure out a way to get along without them. And I think we'll actually be fine. But those, best I can tell, by and large, there are certainly those who've been the pundit and then decided to run, but that's very few. Because I do really think having the veteran background brings great capability to Congress and a great understanding. It's just where I've drawn the line. We could probably have a debate about this, whether one's different from the other. I think it's dramatically different. Becoming a politician versus being a retired pundit that is, an expert by virtue of showing up, by the way. One of the things it's very rare, if ever, that you ever see any of these pundits referred to by their first name. It is Admiral this, it is Colonel this, it is General this. That's how they're seen, and that's how they're seen by the farmer in Peoria.
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Please, Mary Beth.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Ulrich. I teach civil military relations at the Army War College. So I want to bring it back to your views on retired officers in the profession. And you, of course, are an outstanding example of how to approach that life, but still remain committed to the profession in retirement. I mean, Heidi talked earlier about do no harm and this and that. So I want to extend this. Not only do you remain a member of the profession and have continuing obligations to that profession, and certainly not to do any harm to the profession, but of course also remain committed to that oath of office and to support and defend the Constitution. So my question is, a few months ago, the Washington Post ran sort of investigative reporting they have done on retired generals, and that wasn't just generals, but their focus was on more on the generals, who go to work for authoritarian states and help to build up their militaries. It was mostly Middle Eastern states. I think Saudi Arabia was right up there. And so that was raising questions. I could tell that the reporter writing it seemed to know that this wasn't quite right, but didn't quite have the language to explain like what was wrong with this. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and that could contribute to our writing and teaching in this area. You know, does there have to be another checklist you go through when you take these jobs? Like, oh, am I going to be contributing to a government by building up its military that will then perhaps undermine democracy, you know, things like that. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I certainly, I didn't know them all, but I knew most of them that were, you know, in that piece, you know, led by, you know, my good friend and actually a guy I work for, Jim Jones, specifically. And, you know, the rub, quite frankly, there is MBS, who's a bad guy. That is now for basically running Saudi Arabia, and that is a country. Saudi Arabia is a country that we've had, you know, a need to have a relationship with for a long period of time. Although I would argue, quite frankly, in this decade or in this century, I'm not sure the need is anywhere close to what it used to be. That would be my overall assessment. I think that each individual has to understand what they're getting into, make a conscious decision. Jim Jones isn't the first one to work for, you know, a foreign government, and there are those who who are allies that we need to help assist, you know, in the development of their military, if you will. I mean, quite frankly, a great deal of success that's gone into Ukraine was because of the training that we conducted, mostly active duty, but it wasn't just all that we conducted between 2014 and 2022 when this war started. So I think you have to figure out what's okay and what isn't. I think, Mary Beth, your description of couldn't quite find the language right because it's legal and at the same time, is it somebody that you want to be dealing with? And that's a call I think each individual has to make. And the perception issue there is really significant. Certainly the opportunities are there. I think every individual has to make up their own mind about what's okay and what isn't. And when you're around a place like Saudi Arabia, which has a horrendous human rights background, which, you know, an individual who was responsible for the death of a Washington Post reporter, you know, that to me it's just, you're putting yourself, you know, in the middle of the spotlight. It's just a matter of when somebody turns it on, and that turned it on.
We'll go over here, please.
Sir, Brian Groves. I'm an Army colonel and a good friend of a former aide of yours, John Shine. I have a question for you on the operational realm as it relates to military advice. as we look at the pacing challenge right now in China, as we project out a few years, both on a deterrence side, trying to prevent a war, as well as should the worst occur and we find ourselves in a war with China, how would you advise future senior military leaders that find themselves advising civilian policymakers and the president think about what that advice should look like? What would be first principles? And in light of the Eurasia command comment that you made earlier, is there any dynamic with the reverse of the Las Vegas principles, that what stays in Vegas or happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? I think the opposite is true in Ukraine. What happens in Ukraine won't stay there. It has implications for what might happen with regards to Taiwan in the future. Are there any thoughts that you have about that in light of your previous comment?
Yeah, I'll wander a little bit, but I'll come back to that because I was in a session the other day. Actually, it was on CivMil, and it was a civilian control of the military, and part of what you're talking about today, I think, is the AllVolunteer Force. And I was there when it wasn't the All-Volunteer Force. I mean, this goes back to Vietnam for me. And what I saw then, the need to get out of that. And we've become the most extraordinarily capable, most combat experience force, I think, in the history, certainly of our country, if not the world. But it also goes back, there's a DEI aspect of this. It goes back to us. It goes into the recruiting thing. We've become more and more isolated from the country. We're recruiting from fewer and fewer places. And the degree to which we don't represent the American people, I can't prove this, but I worry a great deal that we're directly, it's almost inversely proportional that the American people are saying, and I've used this for probably 15 years, we're pretty well paid, we're well compensated. It's almost like we're the French Foreign Legion. Go off, fight our dirty little wars, and let us get on with our lives. And I think that's a failed strategy. I also am reminded and was oftentimes, beat up around the head and shoulders by John Warner in particular about what the Constitution says with respect to providing for a Navy and raising an Army. And when you have an Army, as we have had, and when you have technical development like we've had, it becomes too easy to use them. We're not in a war right now, but there are a lot of people that think we're in a proxy war. And when you step back from that, any war is awful, and this one is certainly is as well. But when you step back from that and look how easy it was for us, for the right reasons, I'm a big supporter of what the administration has done. I'd like to see him do it a little faster now because I think Putin's a very dangerous guy. And I think what Lloyd Austin said originally, which is we need to get to a place where Putin can't do this again. I'd like to see Ukraine get into the EU as soon as possible. And I'm not unfamiliar, because I have a lot of time in NATO and Europe, with how hard that is to get in either the EU or NATO. But we're going to need to do that. And to me, that starts to generate an end game that also provides for a future. And as I said earlier, and so it is the weapons that we have, and they're very easy to use. And as a soldier, I think you'll understand this. What leaders miss if they're not standing in a village when a soldier calls in a weapon is the massacre that takes place and the understanding of what it means to go to war. No kidding. And as we develop more and more weapons that are remote, that I'm not looking at the consequences literally as it happens. We've had 2 wars and a lot of arguments about whether they were successful or not. I would argue not, given where we are both in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was too easy to go to war in Iraq, in my view. We didn't have the debate in the country that we needed to have. Now, my answer to that for some time, and this won't go well with my Army buddies, is we need to take the Army down about 100,000 to 350. I disagree with Gates, who said some time ago now, any president or SecDef would be crazy to put 100,000 somewhere. We've never been able to predict where we're going to be next. since 1983. We're batting 0-0-0 in terms of where we're going to go fight. So you could put 100,000 somewhere, but you couldn't relieve them at 350. So you'd have to have a draft to call up. I don't know what the right number is, but let's say you'd have to have to fight this war that's now coming, that I want to put 100,000 out there for. I'm going to have to call up 500,000 kids to support that. And I want that debate to take place at every dinner table in the country. And I want it to be really hard to go to war. It's getting too easy. And that gets into this raise an army when you need it. That's the Constitution that I'm talking about very specifically. And then, as I said earlier, I think, and I've talked to Bob Gates recently, the way he describes it is the tectonic plates have shifted. The moment Putin went in, they have shifted. And I think what's going on in Europe, which is war on the continent, which you and I don't understand because we didn't live there. There was a great piece I read the other day that talked about Finland in particular, but Finland and Sweden and joining NATO, and they got it wrong because they were going to try to romance Putin into having a relationship, almost like the rest of the world, including us, was going to romance China to have a relationship for the future. We've got it wrong on both ends. And so the geostrategic, geo-national security structure has to change to meet that, and they are directly related. I went to Taiwan a year ago this week, at the behest. I took a bipartisan delegation there at the behest of President Biden, and 24 million. It's a thriving democracy. It's a huge lever for the economies of the world because of the semiconductor aspect of who they are. And if we don't stand up for them, then who do we stand up for? And when do we stand up? And if we let the autocrats, these dictators, dictate to the rest of the world, it's just a matter of time. So we need to deter that war with China out there, and we need to do it in a very strong way. And then lastly, because we're running out of munitions, and I don't know what the levels are, and we've sort of been just in time with respect to Ukraine, it's almost, and I was part of this, so I'm putting myself on a report here. It's almost as when we bought these systems and we filled up the magazines, it's almost as if, we need a certain number of rounds, but it's like we really don't believe we're going to have to use them. If Ukraine has taught me one thing, we're going to have to use them, and we need the magazines full, and that's language that Putin and Xi Jinping and other dictators understand. As nice as it would be to have them understand, a gentler conversation, they don't get it. Table stakes is strength, and that's what we have to do. There's a lot there. Sorry.
Thanks, sir. I'm conscious of time. We have 2 more questions. So what I'd ask, if you each ask the question, we'll give both questions to Admiral Mullen to consider and close out. So please go ahead.
Hello, Admiral. My name is Samuel Chen, freshman from George Washington University. Thank you for your comments on the importance of an apolitical military in today's climate. A lot of people here attending this event are students who are hoping to join the civilian side of our national defense leadership, and I was just hoping to ask you for advice on what can civilians in the military leadership do to tamper down on this increased polarization. You've talked about the importance of flag officers to not do that. What are some advice that you would give for us as civilians? I guess somewhere you can start with that is did you work with civilians who did this better than others? And some people who might not have done it as well? Thank you.
I actually worked with the full range. When I think of this, one time in Afghanistan, we were, and Bob Gates and I and others were pushing hard to get more State Department individuals into Afghanistan to participate in these provincial reconstruction teams, et cetera. And on one trip I went, and there were, I went to lunch with 30 of them who had just come in, and they'd come in from Peru and Brazil and Paris and Rome, and Tokyo, and they were 30 years old, and this is where they wanted to be. Why was that? Because this is where the fight was, and this is where service was. And I was so taken back by that experience. And I have found that to be the case, actually throughout the interagency, in these wars. We need more and more of that. And I take my lead from the civilian leadership at every level. So one, you got to learn it. You need to probably spend some time with us so that you understand our culture. And it's a pretty tough culture. And there are many cultures inside the military as well. And then, get involved with either NGOs or the government, various agencies that do this for a living. You're absolutely critical to our future. We need more and more of you to make a difference in this world that's sort of collapsing on us in size, and that will continue to get smaller and smaller, where we need people like you to be more and more engaged.
Thank you, sir. Okay, Sam, last question.
All right, I'll try and keep it quick. Hello, sir. My name is Samantha Woolley. I'm a graduate student here at SSP, and my question was related to, you spoke in your remarks a lot about the recruitment of diverse individuals, particularly for the future officer corps. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit and ask you, beyond just the recruitment of these, diverse individuals, how can also the military improve retention for the future officer corps? Thank you.
Well, retention's always a challenge, and we go up and down over the years and over the decades. I've always been deeply involved in professional development since I was a young officer, quite frankly, for both my enlisted troops as well as my officer corps, right up through the time that I retired. One of the things I say is, if we don't have great people, you can buy all the systems in the world, they ain't going to work. And if you buy great people and don't have the greatest systems, the great people will figure out how to make them work. So that's at the core of the future, which is why I talk about the recruiting issues that we're having right now, which I worry a great deal about, quite frankly. And how do we change? And my own belief is that the one service that has it right from a recruiting standpoint was the Marine Corps. I think it was in the 90s where the Commandant actually shifted the Marine Corps to provide its best majors to run their recruiting stations. And if you put your number ones in anywhere in your military, and this is true in any organization, but if you put your top people, it's going to get better. And I have argued, and I think all the other services need to do this and do it now, because that's where it all starts. We're also trained, many of you obviously in the military, we're also trained, when we start a job, we're going to keep that job until somebody relieves us. So who's your relief? That core of people who we're recruiting, those men and women are our reliefs. And that's as critical a starting place as we have, throughout, and we've got to get that right. Once we get them in, then we've got to figure out a way to keep them. We're still struggling with women officers because they want to go off and start families. I understand that. That's been a struggle for 20, 30 years, and we need to figure out a way to answer the mail there. And we still haven't done that. We've had some sabbatical experience, some I don't want to say prototypes, but experimental, if you will, efforts to try to get at the right answer for that. And we can't. We've got to figure that out as well, but we have to retain our young men and women and in ways. And one thing that's been pretty impactful over the course of time has been bonuses. I'd like to think it's not just about money. It isn't, but you can't having the right bonus level, the right comp level. It's almost table stakes. You're not going to stay in that. And I tell maybe I'll just leave you with this. I tell young men and women forever. Who are leaving the Navy in some cases or the military is one of the things you'll never find anywhere, no matter what you do, is the camaraderie that you have experienced while you've been here in your unit. And it's I don't want to say that's not an impossibility to find, but I certainly haven't seen it in the private sector in the over decade I've been out there now. It's just not there. It's so unique to us as a military, and you're going to give that up, and that's okay. When I have that conversation with young ones, I want them to understand that in terms of how important that has been in their lives, and that they're not going to see that again. So it's a great question, and we have to pay an awful lot of attention to retention, and we do.
So thank you for your time. If I could ask the audience to join me in a warm thanks to you for your time. And sir, I'll give you the last word.
Heidi, the last thing, not that I can task anybody anymore, but my only tasking is do something with this. This is a really critical topic. We just can't have a one-dayer and then proceed on with our lives. There is really a lot here that needs to be worked. And it's not just by you, but you have a great opportunity to contribute. So thanks.